Thank you for joining me as we look at Psalm 106 today. This psalm is in so many ways the twin of Psalm 105. And that psalm, as we saw, traces God's faithfulness to his people all the way from the days of Abraham, right through their time in Egypt, through the years in the wilderness and into Canaan. But now in this psalm, we're looking at the other side of the story, if you like, the other side of the same coin. It seems quite likely that 106 was written during the 70 years of exile in Babylon, because, according to verse 47, the people are scattered among the nations. Some writers suggest that verses 44 to 46 indicate that it was actually written shortly after the exile period. But personally, I think those verses refer to God's repeated deliverance of his people, as illustrated, for example, during the period of the Judges. If you read Psalm 106 straight after Psalm 105, you can easily imagine God's people in exile, aware that they are there because of their own sinfulness and rebellion. And they could even have been reading the account of their history as recorded in 105, and thinking how dreadfully they had treated their God, who had treated them so well. So let's just work our way quickly through this great psalm. First of all, in the first 5 verses, there's a call to praise. And this opening section is interesting because although the psalm is in many ways a communal confession and prayer, it begins on a very personal note. The psalmist asks God to remember me, help me. And then the main section of the psalm is all the way from 6 to 39, which is a confession of sin. It's a catalogue of the persistent national sins of the people, all set against the persistent faithfulness and goodness of God. Look at what it teaches us. First of all, verses 6 to 12, the sin of rebellion. You see, the unbelief of the people didn't begin with the 12 spies, for example. The psalmist tells us in verse 7 that even in Egypt they did not consider the wondrous works of God. They rebelled in their hearts when they were faced with the Red Sea behind them and Pharaoh's forces bearing down on them. Yet, despite their unbelief, in a glorious demonstration of his own power and glory, God delivers them. And for a moment at least, they praised him, says verse 12. And then in verses 13 to 15, there's the sin of complaining. See, that moment of praise didn't last long. Verse 13 tells us, they soon forgot and they began grumbling. And again they grumbled against God, despising his goodness and his faithfulness. I think the psalmist is probably here referring to the events of Exodus 16, which happened just days after they had left Egypt and had safely crossed the Red Sea. And then verses 16 to 18, there's the sin of jealousy. This incident is recorded for us in Numbers 16, and the resulting judgment of God saw more than 14,000 Israelites put to death by God. Verses 19 to 23 highlights the sin of idolatry. This was one of the great besetting sins of the nation, a sin to which they turned again and again throughout their Old Testament history. Most famously, perhaps, as referenced here and recorded in Exodus 32, while Moses was meeting with God on Mount Sinai, Aaron, cajoled by the people, crafted a golden calf, and God was so angered that he would have abandoned them then and there, had not Moses interceded successfully for the people. Verses 24 to 27, the sin of unbelief. Their refusal to trust God to take them safely into the promised land, as recorded in Numbers 13 and 14. One of the great acts of unbelief that resulted in them wandering in the desert for 40 years. And then 28 to 31, once again, the sin of idolatry. This time in the plains of Moab, with the promised land in sight, right across the Jordan. Yet the people were seduced by sexual immorality that was a key part of the Moabite pagan practices. That story is told for us in Numbers 25. Then in 32 to 33, we have again the sin of rebellion. This time, as recorded in Numbers 20, their complaints against God so angered and frustrated Moses that he sinned against God and was himself debarred. from entering the land as a consequence. In verses 34 to 39, the psalmist reminds us of the sin of syncretism. See, once in the promised land, they happily adapted to the pagan practices of the godless nations that were all around them, rather than, as they had been commanded, clearing them out. They accommodated themselves even to the extent of joining in the abhorrent practice of child sacrifice. And then in the last verses of the psalm, 40 to 46, we have the consequences of sin. Two different acts of God in response to the persistent sin of the people are mentioned. His judgment in verses 40 to 43 and his mercy in verses 44 to 46. And all of this, remembering of God's faithfulness in the past, calls the people to cry again. Verse 47, save us again. Friends, as we did in Psalm 105, we can trace our own steps and our own story as we follow that of the Israelites of old. You see, our lives, our spiritual journeys have also, and still are, characterized by rebellion and complaining and jealousy and idolatry and unbelief and so on. No less so than in their case. Alexander MacLaren, the great Scottish preacher and commentator of a previous era, wrote these words: "The history of God's past is a record of continuous mercies. The history of man's, one of continuous sin." And tragically, that is as true of you and me as it was of Israel of old. And the remembrance of it should bring us to our knees again and again, crying to God, as the Israelites did, "Save me again." The Lord bless you and the Lord keep you.